And again, the crew emblem designed by Bob McCall. The breakfast, in this case, was a lunch. And of course, the crew members again, the pilot Charlie Precourt, Nikolai Buterin, who's aboard the Mir still, the Mir 19 commander Anatoly Solovyev, Hoot Gibson, of course, our payload commander Ellen Baker, and Dr. Bonnie Dunbar and Greg Harbaugh. We walked out at early afternoon. This was a whole lot nicer day to be walking out to the orbiter than the previous attempt had been, when they had to actually put the crew van under the awning because the rain was coming down too hard, and so we had to make a quick ingress into the vehicle.
There's a good shot of Hoot when we finally got the go for launch. 2 minutes, visors down, pseudo 2 on, and have a good flight. We were off and running. Most folks maybe don't realize that rendezvous started right here. We had a 5-minute launch window, and we had to wait for the moment in time when Mir's orbit was right directly overhead of us, and we could insert ourselves into the same plane that they were in. We hit that right on time on this particular day. The weather cooperated, and it was a magnificent launch. Anatoly and Nick were very impressed with the vehicle, and we were off and running with a great start here.
Okay, once we got on orbit, we had an awful lot of work to do to get ready for the rendezvous. We opened the payload bay doors. You can see the docking mechanism sitting there with the 6 black dots on the forward end of it. We had just a tremendous amount of activity at the end of Flight Day 1 and then all of Flight Day 2, getting our computers ready to go, getting our rendezvous tools set up. We had 1 or 2 unexpected events, including a little work that had to be done on the handheld laser, but we got ready to go in time.
We flew an intercept on the Mir that had us pick up the radius vector, or essentially come in right underneath the Mir and fly up below them all the way into docking. This was a pretty intensive period, as Bonnie and Greg have alluded to, on the flight deck, with the 3 of us flying and everyone else helping as we come in. This is a shot that you saw earlier from the Mir of the orbiter over the Red Sea. We had a very narrow corridor that we had to intercept and fly up so as not to disturb any of the solar arrays on the Mir with our plumes. And as we got into about 500 feet or so, the Mir started its maneuver to the final attitude for docking.
And as it did that, we were able to start locking on with the TCS laser system, because on the end of the docking module were the reflectors that that system could lock onto. So I'm coordinating that activity here with the ground controllers, and you'll see a shot here briefly of that final maneuver. You can see the docking node in the center there starting to come more in alignment with our axis, and you can also see the relative motion of the solar arrays in this particular view. And we were pretty much at the end of this event when the Mir was in attitude. We were ready to go on with it.
As Ben had alluded, it was a very busy time. We had, again, several calls going back and forth between the Mir and the shuttle as docking occurred. We borrowed a little bit of video from the Mir 18 crew on that sequence.
As you may recall, we moved into 30 feet and held for 5 minutes, waiting for the timing to get exactly right. It was our objective in the course of the rendezvous not to have to fire any braking pulses towards the Mir, and we were able to work the timeliness, the closure rates, and the distances such that that worked out just fine. We were able to utilize natural orbital braking to bring us all the way into docking, and never did have to fire a braking pulse all the way in. This is the actual moment of docking as seen from the aft flight deck, from one of the payload bay cameras looking out, and this is a shot that came down to the ground that showed both the centerline camera view as well as the view out the aft flight deck. As you probably recall, we had a very tight window on the actual docking.
Well, this was the hard part. We had 6 people with cameras on one side of the hatch and 2 people with cameras on the other side of the hatch, and of course everybody wanted to get a good picture. We had a variety of different cameras, stills, videos, IMAX, you name it, we had it. We didn't want to miss the hatch opening and the handshake, and you'll see we're flashing lights in each other's faces here. But it was an awfully exciting time, and we just couldn't wait to get that hatch open and greet our comrades.
We had been training and preparing for this moment for so long over the preceding year, working together with the Mir 18 and the Mir 19 crews. When the actual moment came, we found ourselves looking around and saying, "Are we really here? And have we really made this work?" We had just a very brief greeting and a very brief ceremony, if you will, at the actual hatch. And of course, this was the first time that we had seen Norm and Volodya and Gennady, I guess in the previous, 8 months, I guess it had been since we had seen them.
And of course, going a little out of plan, we had a plan prior to this, and first thing we did was take that plan and toss it, and we all lined up and went into the Mir at that time. All 10 of us, I guess, were in there at that time, and I kept the camera running as we went through the Crystal module and arrived in the base block where we did our welcoming ceremony, I think.
So there we were, all accumulating ourselves in the base block or the core module. Obviously elated, really happy to see Gennady and Volodya and Norm, and they were, I think, happy to see us. I think it's the first time there have been 10 human beings in one spacecraft, and to commemorate the occasion, Bonnie put a STS-71 crew patch up on one of their comm pieces of equipment.
The following day, then, we congregated back in the Space Lab, and we performed a gift exchange, and we also mated a model of the Mir space station with the Space Shuttle. A little bit adrift. There's also a tour of the Space Shuttle that was conducted for Russian audiences. Norm did this, and in these sequences he's taking Gennady around the shuttle, and he'll later narrate this for a Russian audience, first in the commander's seat and now back in the aft flight deck where Charlie is showing him the controls for the docking adapter.
Well, once we got all the PAO events out of the way, we could get to work on some of the science objectives of the flight, and the day after docking we did start on some of the experiments. We had a small series of experiments to do on this flight that looked primarily at the cardiovascular system, exercise, fitness, endurance, those sorts of things, and also some metabolic studies to look at biochemical, hormonal changes in the blood, changes in the blood chemistry, things like that. And Bonnie and I orchestrated most of this. Couldn't have done it, obviously, without our subjects' participation and full cooperation.
And it was a pretty long day. As Ellen mentioned, we had rehearsed this before, and with our Payload Operations Control Center down here on the ground, the POC. It all went as planned. As was previously mentioned, we performed several baro experiments on all 3 of the subjects, got some excellent quality data. We're very happy with it. Ellen also performed a number of metabolic experiments called MGAS. Here she's connecting up a rebreathing bag to Volodya.
And we also flew the lower body negative pressure device as a joint experiment between the Russians and the Americans. We had principal investigators from both countries on all of our studies. The Russians used lower body negative pressure as a countermeasure. We use it as a research tool, and we used it as a little of both on this flight.
Greg is wincing because he's having his blood taken there, and he'd rather be jogging like I am here, I think.
It didn't really hurt. Okay, we, as mentioned earlier, we did an awful lot of transferring of equipment, scientific and materiel. Here Hoot is transferring something called the PCG, and it's just one example of the tremendous amount of effort we put into those 5 dock days and moving stuff back and forth between the 2 vehicles. One unsung tremendous capability of the shuttle is its ability to return hardware back to Earth, and we took full advantage of it on this flight.
One of the more pleasant things we had the opportunity to do is talk to school kids around the world. We had SARX contacts in California, Texas, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and over in Russia. We used the SARX radios on board both the station Mir and the shuttle.
And as we showed in our slide, one of the big moments for us was to be able to show the new rocket's emblem and present the shirt to Anatoly, who promptly put it on and decided to demonstrate his basketball style, which I'm sure that is the envy of anyone who's been in zero-G.
Here we are closing the hatch, and we've already said our last goodbye there. And then there's Anatoly saying goodbye to us, eating a tortilla through one of the viewports on Kvant. Or Crystal, I guess it is.
Greg and Bonnie were talking there about getting pressure checks done as we prepared for this moment. The Soyuz undocks from the Mir on the opposite end of the station and begins its fly around. We watched it with amazement at how well controlled it was and how stable. And Ellen's in the process of snapping it on the IMAX here, which came out quite well. We got to review that the other day. But Anatoly flew out of plane here, as you see him moving between the panels to a position about 60, 80 meters to the commander's side of the orbiter, I guess the port side, and station kept there while we prepared to do our undocking.
These scenes make the Soyuz look pretty small and look pretty far away. Let me tell you how close he looked when he was sitting out there. His, I guess he had a laser rangefinder, and you can see some of the jet firings here as he was holding attitude just right out the window. We felt like we could reach out and touch him because he was that close to us. His range, I think, was about 65 meters, but again, he looked very, very close as the actual time for undocking approached.
At about 3 minutes prior to the actual separation, I sent the command to open the hooks, and everything worked just like clockwork. That mechanism worked superbly. And there was a set of push-off springs that separated the two vehicles initially, and then at about 2 feet, Hoot initiated a separation maneuver, 4 pulses, to complete the SEP sequence. This is a view, I guess, from the Soyuz, looking at us as we do that undocking.
Of course, when we finally separated, the Mir 18 crew came up, waved goodbye. We had some exchanges on the VHF radio as well as we said sayonara. You're also seeing on the left there the Soyuz redocking. It was a little departure from our plan to dock an orbit later, but you can just see it start to close in there. Anatoly did an excellent job. I was in the commander's seat. He flew from the port side to the starboard side of the vehicle and did a very smooth redocking.
As we completed that part of the fly around and got the photo there, we started a complete revolution around the Mir and got these real pretty views of the station. And here you can see it rotating. The folks on the ground were very interested to see views of the different sides of the Mir to see what kind of condition it's been in after a long exposure to space.
As Charlie mentioned, we flew all the way around the Mir, doing more than a 360-degree fly around, and finally got to a point overhead the Mir on what we call the -R bar and did our final separation burn and started translating away from the Mir space station.
Well, shortly after that, we continued our work in the lab. Of course, one of the things that would be important for Norman and his crew members to do is to maintain their conditioning in anticipation of entry. The intent was to exercise twice a day. I think we missed that a few times for those guys, but they did manage to get some of their exercise in. And another modification we did was to use the recumbent seats at the shuttle so that they would have the gravity vector going through the chest rather than from the head to the toes, and make the G-forces of re-entry a lot easier on them.
This, of course, shows the shuttle as we re-entered, flew around the hack, and came down final approach. The one little surprise we got on final was a master alarm, which proved to be a false sensor indication, but we just pressed right on. At 300 feet, I lowered the gear here, and Hoot set up on the outer glide path just nice and solid and brought it on in.
We were a relatively lightweight orbiter, about 219,000 pounds coming in for landing, so we were shooting at a 195 knot touchdown as opposed to the heavyweight flights where we shoot at 205 knots. And this is us touching down on runway 15 at the Kennedy Space Center on July the 7th, ending a very successful 10-day flight. We, of course, used the drag chute. We had a normal drag chute deploy. For this landing, we had a little bit of crosswind, not enough to cause us any real difficulty, and we're able to fly a normal approach and landing all the way through the drag chute deployment and drag chute jettison that you see here. We walked out at early afternoon. This was a whole lot nicer day to be walking out to the orbiter than the previous attempt had been, when they had to actually put the crew van under the awning because the rain was coming down too hard, and so we had to make a quick ingress into the vehicle.
There's a good shot of Hoot when we finally got the go for launch. 2 minutes, visors down, pseudo 2 on, and have a good flight. We were off and running. Most folks maybe don't realize that rendezvous started right here. We had a 5-minute launch window.
A lot of work to do to get ready for the rendezvous. We opened the payload bay doors. You can see the docking mechanism sitting there with the 6 black dots on the forward end of it. We had just a tremendous amount of activity at the end of Flight Day 1 and then all of Flight Day 2, getting our computers ready to go, getting our rendezvous tools set up. We had 1 or 2 unexpected events, including a little work that had to be done on the handheld laser, but we got ready to go in time.
We flew an and again, the crew emblem designed by Bob McCall. The breakfast, in this case, was a lunch, and of course the crew members again, the pilot Charlie Precourt, Nikolai Buterin, who's aboard the Mir still, the Mir 19 commander Anatoly Solovyev, Hoot Gibson, of course, our payload commander Ellen Baker, and Dr. Bonnie Dunbar and Greg Harbaugh.
And we had to wait for the moment in time when Mir's orbit was right directly overhead of us, and we could insert ourselves into the same plane that they were in. We hit that right on time on this particular day. The weather cooperated, and it was a magnificent launch. Anatoly and Nick were very impressed with the vehicle, and we were off and running with a great start here.
Okay, once we got on orbit, we had an
Offset on the Mir that had us pick up the radius vector, or essentially come in right underneath the Mir and fly up below them all the way into docking. This was a pretty intensive period, as Bonnie and Greg have alluded to, on the flight deck, with the 3 of us flying and everyone else helping as we come in. This is a shot that you saw earlier from the Mir of the orbiter over the Red Sea. We had a very narrow corridor that we had to intercept and fly up so as not to disturb any of the solar array.